Thank you, Pamela, for that very generous introduction. And it's very symbolic of the great support, collegiality, and good cheer that's come to the fellows of this academy during this semester from the staff of the American Academy in Berlin. And I thank you, and I think I speak for the other fellows in thanking you for all that you do to make our stay here both enjoyable and productive. I'd also like to thank my co-fellows for their love and collegiality in this endeavor that two of us have already embarked upon. So thank you very much. William Stuart Nelson in India, the making of a religious intellectual. The U.S. civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, a scholarly field of crucial importance in modern American history, still has a grip on the public's imagination, both in the United States and abroad. Through media documentaries or dramatic scenes of courageous but vulnerable demonstrators, challenging petty racist tyrants in Southern settings, and countless recordings of the soaring rhetoric of the iconic Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders have kept alive memories of this transformational era in the American experience. The inspirational and instructive campaign to end the violent subjugation and civic inequality of African Americans has become a model for other grassroots movements elsewhere across the globe. Through hagiography, memoirs, and film, this narrative of struggle and triumph has converted these events into phenomena of transnational significance. The civil rights movement, considered in the context of the Cold War era, gained a high moral reputation from its nonviolent methodology. Major leaders and grassroots activists, through rhetoric and action, targeted their attack on the infrastructure and mechanisms of racial subordination. The defenders of these systems, though at times brutal in their enforcement, were viewed as fellow human beings whose consciences could transform them into allies. Hence, nonviolence, a moral methodology that was both a philosophy and a praxis, elevated the civil rights struggle onto a higher plane of human activity. No wonder it was perceived as a crusade free of the moral untidiness and ethical challenges of militarism and Cold War power politics. William Stuart Nelson, in 1958, some months after Martin Luther King Jr. led a successful Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, declared in Peace News that the young minister was the Gandhi of America. King, he said, embodied what Gandhi taught about love, forgiveness, and nonviolence, the same principles that King's own Christian religion had taught him. Nelson had standing to confer Gandhi's mantle upon King. He knew Gandhi, interacted with him, learned from him, and stood with him during a period of interreligious violence in India. Nelson became the conduit and the linear connection between the Indian leader and the emergent civil rights movement in America. Moreover, King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, James Farmer, the Congress of Racial Equality, and other frontline civil rights leaders brought to fruition the Gandian nonviolent strategy in the United States. They, of course, owed their introduction to nonviolence to an earlier generation of African American religious intellectuals. These men, all educators and Baptist ministers, met Mohandas K. Gandhi in the 1930s and 1940s and studied his use of satyagraha as a belief and strategy to undermine British colonialism in India. A process of diffusion brought Gandhian nonviolence to the United States, especially to Black educational institutions where it was imparted to students who would later lead the civil rights struggle. President Benjamin E. Mays at Morehouse College exposed King, his student, as did President Mordecai W. Johnson of Howard University. Howard Thurman did the same with his thesis student, James Farmer, at the Howard School of Religion. And William Stuart Nelson, Thurman's colleague, influenced graduates Kelly Miller Smith in the Nashville, Tennessee movement and Frederick C. James in the Sumter, South Carolina movement. Nelson, within this crucial cadre of African American religious intellectuals, had sustained interaction with Gandhi and became an acknowledged authority on nonviolence in the United States. The bespectacled, slender, and dignified William Stuart Nelson seemed an unlikely precursor to nonviolent direct action practitioners who marched in street demonstrations, sat at lunch counters, or shielded themselves from billy club blows from seemingly sadistic policemen. His vocation, after all, was that of a seminary dean and university administrator who thrived in the life of the mind. Beneath the surface of his scholarly mien simmered impatience with American racism, a tenacious determination to fight it, and a commitment to achieve this objective through the power of nonviolence. As a result, his cornerstone contributions to the civil rights movement, and hence his indispensable presence as one of his major progenitors, lay in three areas. First, Nelson and his colleagues, Johnson, Mays, Thurman, George D. Kelsey, and others, immersed themselves in the study of Gandian nonviolence, taught the topic to students, and lectured and wrote extensively about it. In so doing, they laid an intellectual foundation for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Hence, Gandian ideas and vocabulary diffused into the discourse of movement leaders and activists and became a normative feature of the rhetoric and strategies of the Black freedom struggle. Nelson, as the most prolific scholar and lecturer on Gandian nonviolence among his colleagues, had the greatest influence within the Black freedom struggle. Second, Nelson unambiguously viewed religion as intrinsic to the envisaging and shaping of the civil rights movement. This perspective derived initially from his study of Christianity, but deepened into an in-depth examination of pacifism and Quaker thought and radiated outward into an intense exploration of the religious roots of Gandian satyagraha. These queries led Nelson to the world's great living religions and to the conclusion that innumerable scriptures within their sacred texts emphasize peace, love, and nonviolence. In these respects, the U.S. civil rights movement could speak to broader issues of class, caste, and hierarchy, all of which drew censure from the major religions. Hence, Nelson saw the struggle for Black rights as a part of a larger project aimed at world reconstruction through the espousal of peace, love, and nonviolence. Third, Nelson's presence in India in the 1940s and twice again in the 1950s highlighted the transnational attributes of the civil rights movement. His crucial role in the intellectual transfer of Gandian ideas from the Asian subcontinent to America involved Nelson in what one scholar described as relational diffusion. It pertains to theorists and activists in one setting who, through interpersonal relationships and direct communication channels, identified with counterparts in another venue. Through these interactions, protest information passed from transmitters and receivers. Nelson, within this transnational transaction, functioned as a recipient of Gandhi's instruction that he in turn reinterpreted, reinvented, and conveyed to colleagues, students, and practitioners during the entirety of the civil rights movement. These three factors that tied Nelson to the civil rights movement converged in India in 1946 and 1947. Already he endorsed the founding of A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington movement and its aim in 1941 to mobilize 100,000 blacks to demand the end of job discrimination in World War II defense industries. To extend the March on Washington movement influence to other nonviolent direct action initiatives led Nelson to study Quaker pacifism and Gandian nonviolence and how they connected to each other. An opportunity came from the American Friends Service Committee to administer the Friends Service Unit in Calcutta, India. Although this assignment required Nelson to discharge various bureaucratic responsibilities, there was still time to study Quaker pacifism in depth and to learn about nonviolence from his encounters with Gandhi himself. In India, Though he discovered differences between these complementary sets of moral principles and practices, Nelson concluded that religious ideas from multiple sources could energize grassroots activism in ways that too few theorists and activists had considered. He found that peace, love, and nonviolence were salient themes in the sacred scriptures of the great living religions, and that struggles against hegemonic systems, whether manifested in colonialism or segregation, could be activated through these universal principles. Thus, William Stuart Nelson, while in India, emerged as an intellectual whose interreligious inquiries developed in him capacious perspectives on how moral methodologies could invigorate social insurgency. Born in 1895 in Paris, Kentucky, as the only child of a physician, Nelson's intellectual maturation occurred in cosmopolitan contexts. As a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army during World War I, he saw action in France, fighting on assignment with the French Army. Right after the war, he finished his interrupted education at Howard University, where he earned a BA in 1920. He returned to France to study at the Sorbonne and the adjacent Protestant Theological Seminary in Paris in 1920 and 1921. That's the Sorbonne. The city was already a cultural mecca for African American musicians, dancers, artists, writers, and scholars. Also, Nelson, who became fluent in French, met with such Francophone Africans as Blaise Diagne of Senegal, his country's representative in the Chamber of Deputies since 1914. He met Diagne as one of two translators for him and W.B. Du Bois at the Third Pan-African Congress. That's Diagne and Du Bois. That's Du Bois. That's Rayford Logan, one of the other translators, Du Bois and Diagne. These interactions motivated Nelson's serious reflection about the plight of African Americans, the question of race and empire, and the need to stir greater awareness among Americans and Europeans concerning these international issues. In his book, The Black Race in American Democracy, published in French in 1922, Nelson observed that subject peoples in the colonies of France, Great Britain, and other European powers have formulated demands until now unheard of, and subjugated peoples have claimed their liberty with extraordinary insistence. He added that in international relations, the presence of blacks has always been important. Similarly, the race issue in the United States is much more important than most people believe. Nelson's book took aim to correct misperceptions about race in the American context and to educate Europeans about the issue. I had barely arrived in France, he said, when I met an otherwise open-minded Frenchman who obviously believed in the slander and negative portrayals that white Americans spread about African Americans. This book and Nelson's subsequent studies in Germany at Berlin and Marburg before earning a Yale divinity degree developed him as an intellectual accustomed to experiencing and framing issues about blacks in America in a global context. That's the University of Berlin, where he studied. One of his professors, Adolf Diefman, Adolf von Harnack, and Titlius. I've forgotten his first name, forgive me. Arthur Titlius. That's quite a professor. Nelson's vocational direction and his intellectual trajectory, however, diverged in the late 1920s and 1930s. Though he taught religion and philosophy at Howard University, he mainly functioned as an administrator and later president of two institutions, Shaw from 1931 to 1936 and Dillard from 1936 to 1940. When he became dean of Howard School of Religion, Nelson, though already interested in training socially conscious clergy, now had opportunities to implement this praxis in a seminary. Beyond educating insurgent black preachers, as did his seminary predecessor, Benjamin E. Mays, Nelson wanted to equip them with ideas and moral methodologies to transform the segregated environment that they would surely confront. This objective required him to go to India to meet Gandhi. This is Marburg, where he studied. One of his professors, Rudolf Otto. The other was Rudolf Bultmann. That's Howard University, where he spent most of his career. Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, Howard Thurman, George Kelsey, his colleagues who were fellow black intellectuals who also were interested in Gandhi. This is Nelson with Ralph Bunche on the far left, and Elaine Locke, one of the fathers of the Harlem Renaissance. Already, there was buzz about Gandhi in seminary circles. In 1931, for example, 6 black seminarians at Yale Divinity School, Nelson's alma mater, organized a conference on Whither, the Negro Church. One of its resolutions recommended that every Negro church must discover and develop a type of leadership that would do for America and the Negro what Gandhi has done for India and what Jesus has done for the world. Moreover, Nelson's colleagues, Mays and Thurman, met Gandhi on separate occasions in 1936. They engaged him about his nonviolent campaign against British colonialism and whether his philosophy and praxis could upend the segregation and legalize discrimination that African Americans encountered in American society. Gandhi was both interested and sanguine about satyagraha as a part of the black freedom struggle, saying that nonviolence would be delivered to the world through the example of African Americans. Nelson wanted to know more. He was mindful of Quakers and their historic pacifism, but he aimed to identify areas of congruence between it and Gandhi's nonviolence. How could the two philosophies, harnessed to normative Christian beliefs, energize a movement to free African Americans from the crippling and at times deadly effects of Jim Crow in America? Nelson, in his Yale thesis, already had written about the early and consistent opposition of Quakers to slavery. As Howard's divinity dean, and he's pictured here with the divinity school class of 1944, his school benefited from Friends philanthropy. These interactions acquainted him with the American Friends Service Committee. Founded in 1917, the AFSC supplied non-combatant work to Quakers opposed to World War I. Out of this initiative derived the global commitment to relief services to peoples trapped in hapless circumstances of war and natural disasters. For his sabbatical leave in 1946-1947, Nelson proposed that he and his wife, Blanche Wright Nelson, work at the Friends Service Unit in Calcutta. He would study Quaker pacifism, meet Gandhi, and invigorate his thinking about how religion and nonviolence could inform the emerging civil rights movement in America. The assignment of the Nelsons to the service unit in Calcutta brought him face to face with the pacifist methodology of Quakers as applied to India's poor. While providing religiously based service, the AFSC facility and others like it also functioned as a meeting place of a two-way interpretation between Quakers and their aid recipients, many of them from diverse religious backgrounds. Additionally, the Calcutta Center was one of several Quaker sites where like-minded people can share in an attempt to restate changeless verities. So far from proselytizing, Quakers were in search of universal values and beliefs that bridged seemingly impenetrable religious differences. Increasingly, Nelson adopted this approach and seeing that a common adherence to peace, love, and nonviolence grounded many of the great living religions and was useful in energizing struggles against colonialism, segregation, and other hegemonic systems. Quakers, not unlike mystics like Howard Thurman and Gandhi himself, believed that violence was done to the inner being of peoples when privation defined the totality of their existence. Hence, Nelson also learned that the delivery of Quaker relief services was foundational to efforts to achieve social transformation in Indian society. It was never self-evident to Quakers how their religious tenets, despite their broad flexibility, applied to relief services in India's diverse religious environment. Nelson, as much as the Quakers themselves, inquired about this integration between religion and relief and how it advanced the sect's primary belief in pacifism. Because most of the Calcutta staff was non-Christian, and specifically non-Quaker, Nelson welcomed from the AFSC headquarters its useful volume, A Guide to True Peace. The book was helpful in teaching center employees core Quaker principles and how they could inform interaction with relief recipients. Moreover, a conference on Quakerism that Nelson helped to host focused on Friends' history and philosophy. He thought that in making the center more authentically Quaker, the universal appeal of the life of Christ would be salient in their motives and methodology. That also included Quaker worship services that welcomed those who did not call themselves Christian in any orthodox sense, and seekers who professed no explicit statement of faith. The ultimate objective of the Quaker presence in India lay in connecting the inner light and a peace testimony. These core sources of Quaker identity, the AFC and Nelson himself believed, should inform all their activities and strike a blow for peace. Nelson's moves to shore up the Quaker identity of the Calcutta Service Center showed his administrative acumen. More importantly, he helped to articulate and operationalize Quaker pacifism through its relief activities. Recipient clients, though receiving material support, also learned that peace objectives were integral to these ministrations. Just as Nelson, who supported the mass grassroots mobilization of A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington movement and his grounding in Gandian direct action, saw similar possibilities in Quaker aid to the Indian population. These relief for peace activities communicated an important principle that could be crucial to a nonviolent transition to a just post-colonial social order. The Quakers chose the Nelsons to go to India to insert an interracial aspect to their overseas operations. Therefore, both the Friends and Indians were anxious that both Nelsons should lecture about the plight of blacks in the United States. Hence, Nelson spoke in a Bengalese university community, at the History and Political Science Studies Association of India, at Madras Christian College, at a YWCA meeting, and to the Manu Convention of the Syrian Christian Church. Blanche Nelson joined her husband in addressing the Government College of Muslim Girls, the St. Christopher Training College, and the wider Quaker Fellowship. In most of the engagements, he observed, we spoke on some aspect of international and interracial understanding, particularly a discussion of race relations. At the YWCA, for example, he talked about the Christian attitude toward the colored problem. His interaction with the followers of Parsi thought and practice led Nelson to additional study of this sect within the religion of Zoroaster. That's a scene from Calcutta in 1947 when Nelson arrived. This is India after the partition. You can see the present day East Pakistan, Bangladesh, which was once a part of India, and the present day Pakistan, which had become West Pakistan. All that was a part of Indian territory before the partition, but now separate parts of India after the partition of 1947. And the next is of Mahatma Ghandi himself. Nelson arrived in India as a Randolph admirer. Randolph's emulation of the mass mobilization techniques of Gandhi pressured the administration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt to establish a federal agency, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, to combat job discrimination in wartime defense industries. With this in mind, Nelson, while in India, observed that Negroes would find a potent instrument in the type of sacrificial spirit of non-cooperation which has proved so successful in India. He added that a mass hunger strike as a protest against brutalities, mass non-utilization of segregated public carriers, and non-attendance at segregated places of amusement are important possibilities. Now that Nelson had imbibed both the Quaker peace testimony and Randolph's mass mobilization strategies, he was ready to meet Gandhi in order to complete his education. Nelson's Quaker experiences and his familiarity with Randolph's mass mobilization techniques framed his encounters with Gandhi. He expected to find areas of congruence between Quaker pacifism operationalized in AFSC relief activities and Gandhian initiatives and direct action against British colonialism and peace solutions to the interreligious violence arising between Hindus and Muslims. In both interactions, with the Quakers and with Gandhi, Nelson did not reckon with peace, love, and nonviolence as subjects for spiritual reflection, but as values and concepts thrust into the rough and tumble of messy human affairs. The name Gandhi was familiar on the Howard University campus as early as 1924. In that year, the head of the Indian Nationalist Party spoke about Gandhi, teaching his people the principle of non-cooperation without resort to force. Mays and Thurman encountered him in the mid-1930s when British control in India remained intact and mass disobedience against colonial rule continued. Nelson's presence from late 1946 through most of 1947, however, coincided with negotiations over British withdrawal and a partition of India and Pakistan. Interfaith violence erupted, resulting in religious dispersions of Hindus and Muslims into disparate ethnic asylums. Nelson's interaction with Gandhi occurred within these volatile circumstances. Nelson's relationship with Gandhi started within a potentially complicated circumstance. As India moved toward independence, the Quakers offered their service units to aid in the process. Gandhi, who had criticized the Red Cross because of its closeness to the British Crown, cast the same suspicions upon the Quakers. Therefore, he challenged them to serve without any ulterior motive, forswear any proselytizing, and most surprisingly for this pacifist group, to renounce the way of violence. The Quakers assured the Indian leader that their peace witness formed the basis of their recruitment for service rather than membership or missionary activities. Gandhi's doubt about the Quakers, however, did not disturb Nelson. Already he had advocated the indigenization of fringe projects so as to avoid European and American attitudes and actions suggesting Western superiority and missionary motives. In one of their encounters, Gandhi affirmed Nelson's own critique of the Quakers by suggesting an operational principle for relief and rehabilitation for Indians that preserved their dignity. Gandhi taught that the spiritual importance of helping men meet their physical needs required a vigorous articulation. He said, to the hungry, God is food. To the naked, God is clothing. To the homeless, God is shelter. Nelson adopted this Gandhian approach and used it to organize a conference on village reconstruction. Though Nelson was anxious to engage Gandhi about race issues in the United States, the violent fallout from the imminent partition of the British Indian Empire became their preoccupation. When the British announced this division, religious rivalries about which sects, Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus would dominate in particular provinces and where borders would be drawn led to extraordinary carnage. Shortly before Nelson arrived in Calcutta from the United States, for example, Muslims and Hindus in August 1946 fought and the fatalities numbered 4,000 and the injured amounted to 10,000. In the ensuing months, there was a series of partition massacres. In Noakhali and East Bengal, present-day Pakistan, Hindu temples were burned, and Muslims threatened to oust Hindus from the area. Gandhi plunged himself into such circumstances. He went to one such area in November 1946 and stayed until March 1947. Nelson, traveling for the first time to meet him, trekked over 200 miles from Calcutta in West Bengal to join the Indian leader. After hours of truck travel over impossible roads and a 3-mile journey by foot, he recalled, I found him in a simple hut of a tiny village. Far from intellectual interactions with Gandhi about theoretical nonviolence, Nelson witnessed the tie that the Indian leader drew between spiritual discipline and strategy in diffusing deadly encounters between Hindus and Muslims. Nelson had spent 3 days with Gandhi in prayer meetings and more than 1 day with him in his ashram. Out of these ascetic settings of prayer, fasting, and reflection, Nelson credited Gandhi with bringing the first peace and intercommunal fellowship which the embattled city had known for months. Gandhi achieved these objectives despite an unfriendly reception from annoyed fellow Hindus who attacked his dwelling because of his outreach to rival Muslims. Divine intervention, some said, had occurred. Gandhi's presence drew throngs to his daily prayer meetings, masses of people who followed wherever he went and received his blessing and simple and sound advice. Nelson recalled that Gandhi asked a Muslim leader, the object of bitter hatred by many Hindus, to join him in a house in one of Calcutta's riot-stricken sections, and thus offer an example of the kind of unity which should obtain between Hindus and Muslims. The result was a peace, however short-lived, that demonstrated the moral power of Gandhi's example of nonviolence and reconciliation. The calm, however, descended again into hostilities and convinced Gandhi to declare a fast until the violence stopped. Nelson deployed the Calcutta Service Unit to aid Gandhi in his effort to restore peace. As Nelson's time in India drew to an end, he persuaded Gandhi to reflect with him about the prospects for nonviolence in the black struggle for freedom. Already disappointed that Indians who supported his non-cooperation campaigns against the British had turned on each other with unimaginable violence, pushed Gandhi into serious introspection. His followers, he said, had engaged in the tactic of passive resistance and had not internalized nonviolence in thought, word, and deed. Thus, chastened by these recent experiences of internecine conflict, Gandhi shied away from sending any lofty pronouncements to African Americans. A man's best message, he observed, is his life. And what could that life teach? He referred to soul force, or satyagraha, as a more positive expression of the idea of nonviolence. It stressed non-cooperation with evil and a determination to fight pernicious structures through an articulation of truth expressed through opposition to these hegemonic systems. The battle between soul force and evil structures brought moral clarity and allowed the practitioners of satyagraha to oppose systems without demonizing the defenders of these structures. This life example, noted Gandhi to Nelson, could be instructive to African Americans. What was Nelson's takeaway from his 10 months in India? Most importantly, he witnessed in New Delhi on August 14, 1947, the transfer of power from the British to Indian hands. Ironically, Nelson noted that the most impressive aspect of it was the absence of Mahatma Ghandi. Here there was a transpiring event to bringing of which he had devoted a great portion of his life. Here men were proclaiming him the architect of their freedom, the father of their country. Instead, he was traveling in his third-class car, headed for a village in Pakistan, where he promised to devote the rest of his life to the minority of Hindus. On January 30th, 1948, however, a fellow Hindu assassinated him. Gandhi in the East was like one Jesus of Nazareth in the West, who gave his life for the rebirth of spiritual power. Despite this tragic scenario in Gandhi's life, at least for Nelson, read like an allegory for what he envisaged for the black freedom struggle in the United States. He took from his experiences in India 3 Gandian guidelines that he conveyed to his seminary students in the 1940s and to other civil rights activists in the 1950s and 1960s. First, Nelson, after coming from India, published Basis for World Understanding in 1949. In it, he argued that the universal values of peace, love, and nonviolence commonly appeared in the sacred texts of the great living religions. This discovery drew from conversations with Gandhi in which he said all religions are true. Also, the Indian leader stressed loyalty to one's faith without blind orthodoxy and freedom from dogmatism without unbelief. This intellectual posture permitted Nelson to argue for a broader interreligious foundation for the civil rights movement and to reconcile its objectives with tenets found in the Torah, New Testament Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, and other religious writings. Second, Nelson affirmed that nonviolence should be an indispensable philosophy and practice in the civil rights movement. Core to nonviolence was the Gandian notion of ahimsa, or doing no harm. Gandhi, he noted, recoiled at taking life or injuring the living. Moreover, the object of his nonviolent movement in India was to destroy the English system of oppression, but to insist that not a hair of an Englishman's head should be touched. Nelson eulogized Gandhi as the world's preeminent practitioner of nonviolence. Nelson became a conduit who passed that legacy to Martin Luther King Jr., that noble disciple of Gandhi who found that the heart of nonviolence is love. Finally, Gandhi, said Nelson, believed in mass action. Randolph, whom Nelson admired, emulated the Indian leader in this tactic through his March on Washington movement. This tactic became the signature practice of the civil rights movement and responsible for significant successes in the 1963 March on Washington and the 1965 Selma to Montgomery March. Nelson was reminded that Gandhi also noted the power of the one, as shown in the lives of Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad, who stood alone always, either through mass action or in the witness of one, whether it was Rosa Parks or James Meredith. The power of satyagraha and its onslaught against evil systems and pernicious structures met with the moral force of truth. This was the highest expression of Gandhian nonviolence and the embodiment of his legacy diffused from India to the United States through such persons as William Stuart Nelson. This is his graduating class from the School of Religion in 1947. Fred James here became the leader of the local civil rights movement in Sumter, South Carolina. Nelson returned to India during the summer of 1950. The World Student Service Fund, an interreligious federation, invited him to participate in the Indian Roundtable to address academic exchange between American and Indian universities and religious instruction within academia in India. Most importantly, an official at the Friends Service Unit in Calcutta expressed great interest in Nelson coming to the site of his earlier sabbatical to talk about race relations. A similar invitation from the Indian Institute of Culture suggested one of three topics, including the color problem. Nelson's presence in India proved consequential to the modern civil rights movement. His study and experiences with the moral methodologies of Quaker pacifism and Gandian nonviolence showed how these philosophies operated in the turbulent transition away from British colonialism to Indian independence. Caught between the vertical relationships of occupiers and subject peoples and the horizontal interactions among rival religious sects tested whether the peace witness of both Quakers and Gandians were practicable. Nelson was convinced, however, that whatever the colonial and internecine conflicts in India, the spiritual force of nonviolence, while far from an immediate panacea, advanced greater possibilities for peace and reconciliation than a resort to violence. Nonviolence, if reinterpreted and reinvented to fit the Judeo-Christian sensibilities of American society, could then spearhead and sustain a successful onslaught against segregation and legalized racial discrimination. The task of writing, speaking, and teaching about nonviolence in the aftermath of his Indian experiences positioned Nelson as a major consultant and background benefactor of the U.S. civil rights movement. Nelson told King, in the midst of this Montgomery bus boycott, that your methods have made a deep impression upon me because of my association with Mahatma Ghandi and my study of his great ideals. Nelson wanted to discuss with King and his courageous fellow ministers and friends the inner forces and the events which have moved and sustained you. King was pleased that Nelson had communicated with him. Though he first heard about Gandhi in a speech by Nelson's colleague, Mordecai Johnson, he learned that Nelson was the acknowledged authority on the Indian leader. The American Friends Service Committee, because Nelson was headed to India for a third time in 1958 on a Fulbright Fellowship, asked him to accompany King and his wife Coretta on this Quaker-sponsored tour. Nelson's network of Indian scholars, activists, and government officials, the AFSC believed, would make him an enormous asset to the Kings. Though King was delighted by this possibility, Nelson could not accommodate the AFSC request. Nonetheless, King still wanted Nelson's advice on a number of issues. "I trust that you are now settled after your 6-month stay in India," said King to Nelson. "We met many people in India," King continued, "who knew you, and they never tire of mentioning your name in the most favorable manner." Now he solicited a recommendation from Nelson about publications pertaining to the Untouchables. Moreover, he invited Nelson to speak on nonviolence to SCLC's co-sponsored 1959 Leadership Institute. This is a picture. This is Dr. King in the center, and that's William Stuart Nelson right there. This is a photograph of Dr. Nelson, and this is A. Philip Randolph, whom he had long admired for his March on Washington movement. This is Mrs. Nelson, Blanche Wright Nelson, in earlier years, and a picture of her in later years. She was known to slip in unobtrusively into a whole host of civil rights demonstrations, despite her very dignified mien. This is William Stuart Nelson with a delegation of persons visiting the Howard campus from Burma. This is King with a picture of Gandhi here at the rear. This is Kelly Miller Smith, one of Nelson's students at Howard, and that's Dr. Nelson himself. Nelson's appearance in Atlanta to deliver the opening address to the Southwide Leadership Institute on Nonviolent Resistance to Segregation punctuated his steady scholarship and extensive lecturing about nonviolence. The sponsors of the event constituted a who's who in America's accelerating civil rights struggle. They included King and his SCLC Executive Director, Ella Baker, who would spearhead the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960, Glenn Smiley of the Fellowship of Reconciliation that had already been working in the school desegregation battle in Little Rock, and the Committee on Racial Equality, one of whose founders, James Farmer, was graduated from Howard School of Religion during Nelson's incumbency as dean. All recognized that Nelson, and only Nelson, connected them to Gandhian nonviolence and the moral principles that energize its principles and praxis. Nelson spoke about the philosophy and ethical roots of nonviolence. He explored its origins in Christianity and how the ideas of Gandhi, Henry David Thoreau, Leo Tolstoy led to the development of nonviolence as a moral and social force. The Atlanta Daily World, the city's influential black newspaper, covered the conference. It highlighted Nelson's career, referring to his rich background of academic and scholarly achievements. It said Dr. Nelson had wide experience in the study and practice of nonviolence. While in India in the 1940s, the newspaper added, he made a special first-hand study of the life and work of Mahatma Ghandi. Nelson had recently returned from India to observe the influence of Gandhi's program in India's social and political progress. Nelson, of course, as an educator, administrator, and minister, was familiar with current problems of desegregation in terms of the philosophy and practice of nonviolence. The Atlanta Daily World validated Nelson as the intellectual father of nonviolence in America. Time magazine, in its March 17, 1961 issue, featured Nelson in a photograph teaching his interracial class at Howard School of Religion on the philosophy and methods of nonviolence, the first such course ever taught at an American divinity school. He surprised students in one of his sessions with the appearance of his former student, Kelly Miller Smith, a Baptist pastor in Nashville and the leader of its local civil rights movement. Nelson invited Smith to lecture the class about the use of nonviolence in student protests that his group, the Nashville Christian Leadership Conference, spearheaded. Whether it was the national leadership of King or the local leadership of Smith, Nelson could be discerned and documented as a crucial interpreter and intellectual pipeline for Gandian nonviolence conveyed from India to America and from the Indian anti-colonial struggle to the U.S. civil rights movement. Hopefully, my book, A Brother in the Spirit of Gandhi, William Stuart Nelson and the Religious Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, through painstaking biographical excavation, will demonstrate the indispensable influence of this slender, dignified, and soft-spoken seminary dean in the untidy but consequential movement for Black civil rights. Thank you very much. Yes, Pamela.
You briefly touched on the untouchables in India, and I wondered if there had been a dialogue between Nelson and Gandhi about the caste system, because that's also very invidious, and I wonder what role satyagraha played in trying to break down those barriers. I mean,
they didn't converse very much about the untouchables, Gandhi and Nelson, but Nelson came away with a deep interest in the untouchables, and he advised a number of civil rights activists about the parallels between the plight of the Dalits, as they were called in India, and African Americans in the United States. He was aware that Gandhi himself had struggled with that issue. Gandhi, on a number of occasions, had invited untouchables into his ashram, where his wife was greatly upset by bringing persons of such low estate into their midst. The Dalits, however, were not very impressed with Gandhi on this sort of symbolic exercise of seeming equality. They believed that Gandhi never renounced the caste system, that he still adhered to the Hindu notion, the Varna, which is another word for the Indian scriptures, in looking at the four elements of human hierarchy: Brahmins and priests, rulers and warriors, and so forth, with persons of low estate on the fourth rung. Gandhi never renounced that, and the Dalits held him to it. But no, this is not something that Nelson discussed at great length with Gandhi, but Nelson was greatly aware of that and knew that they had parallels with African Americans in the United States.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me make a remark and then pose a question. Yeah. The remark is, I mean, this was a very impressive, kind of powerful, intellectual horse race in a way, and I sometimes found it hard to follow. But what it also shows is, how little we here know about the civil rights movement in the United States. And I think it would be a great opportunity if you could use your stay here beyond the specific subject also to educate us a little more about it, because I think it's, very fascinating for people like us who are in every respect so far away from this. That was the remark. That the question is, did Nelson express in any way that he experienced that his color of skin was an issue in India? Did he feel he was perceived differently as a black person? And then, of course, I'm tempted to ask the same question about his stay in Germany. What was his experience in this respect?
Thank you for the comment and question. No, there's no evidence that Nelson thought that his skin color was either advantage or a disadvantage in India. Although it's very interesting that in some of the bureaucratic correspondence within the American Friends Service Committee, there were doubts among a number of Quakers about sending Nelson and his wife there because they didn't look ostensibly African American. And they thought that since they wanted to emphasize this quote, interracial aspect of their mission, that they were poor representatives of that attempt. Now the other part of it was about his stay in Germany. After Nelson had fought in the French army and returned to France and matriculated both the Sorbonne and the Protestant Theological Seminary, then came on two separate occasions to Germany to study Berlin and later in Marburg, he became fluent in German as well, and interacted with a number of professors at both universities, and seemed quite comfortable as an emerging cosmopolitan intellectual in both settings. And he didn't write at all about any sort of encumbrances placed upon him because of his race, although he was a very avid commentator about the issue of race in general. But he seems not to have encountered very much difficulty in navigating both the French and the German cultures. And if one sees his writings in both settings, one can see that he very, very easily found his way through both settings. And obviously the advantage of learning the language of each and becoming fluent in each aided that attempt, aided that interaction a great deal. Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Kornbluth?
Well, it was very interesting to hear something. I'm somebody who lived through the civil rights movement as a student myself. So it was very interesting for me to hear how Gandhi became injected into this, because this was not something that was known in those. He was not a well-known figure, as you pointed out. And Gandhi, of course, was in those years, we're talking about the 60s and the 70s, had a relevance and a following not just in the African American community, but throughout the, if you will, mostly the student community, but even wider in the United States. What is your impression, if you have one, about the interest in, knowledge of, and application of Gandhi in the United States right now? My impression is very low, but I may not be following it closely enough.
Well, the fate of nonviolence after 1966 in the United States was not a promising one, because it was argued that nonviolence was ineffectual and really didn't address the fundamental issues confronting African Americans and poor people in general, either in the United States or elsewhere in the third world. I think that was a mistake. I think that was a total misreading, because nonviolence and the way in which Gandhi envisaged it, and also in the way in which interpreters like Nelson envisaged it, that it was at its very, very core insurgent and stood against any kind of hegemonic system. So I would argue that it's a fundamental misreading of it. But no, its fate after 1966 in the United States was not a happy one. Although there have been movements subsequent to that have deployed at least some of the tactics and some of the rhetoric. The demonstrations in Tiananmen Square later on, the workers' movement in Poland and other places have adopted aspects of it, but you don't have present in those movements as promising and as laudatory as they were, this sort of deep engagement with the spiritual discipline and the religious depth that comes with a true rendering of Gandhianism.
I ask a follow-up, because since Gandhi, of course, came originally from South Africa, was the victory of the ANC also based to a certain extent on Gandian principles? In
part, but as all of us know, that in 1960 the Sharpeville massacre was a major turning point in that the firing on about 60 or 70 people, the killing of 60 or 70 people in the Sharpeville massacre really radicalized the ANC and turned them away from the exclusive use of nonviolent direct action as a method to upend apartheid.
When Nelson visited Germany, Did German professors have a different attitude than, say, white American professors towards someone like Nelson?
I don't know. He didn't speak on that, but if one just looks at the array of courses that he took and his sterling record in those courses, one can only surmise that he had a favorable experience with them. And he had a similarly favorable experience with, he also attended Union Seminary in New York and as I mentioned, Yale University, Yale Divinity School, where he eventually got his degree. And there was a greater receptivity, there was a great receptivity to his academic aspirations in both settings in both America and Europe. And I don't detect any evidence that he was under any special racial burden in his higher education pursuits.
Speaking of religious groups which preach nonviolence and pacifism, you mainly mentioned the Quakers. Mm-hmm. My question is, did similar religious groups, for example, as the Mennonites or of a more exotic kind, the Amish people, did they also influence the black liberation movement?
They did not, although there is some recent emerging scholarship about some of the peace churches and their contribution to the civil rights movement. But for the most part, the principal nonviolent pacifist strand of thought funneled into the civil rights movement came through the agency of the Quakers and the various organizations of which they were a part. Sometimes the formal yearly meetings, but most often the American Friends Service Committee and those Quaker influences that funneled through the Fellowship of Reconciliation.
I'm wondering what the influence was of the civil rights movement on the student movement, the anti-Vietnam starting around 1963, and also the free speech movement in Berkeley, which were all they were nonviolent movements.
There's a historian, Sarah Evans, I've forgotten the name of the book, who wrote a very influential and useful volume that makes precisely that argument, that the civil rights movement was the source out of which most of the major movements in the early to mid 60s emerged, not only in terms of their moral force and some of the movement vocabulary, but in many cases, many of the free speech, women's movement, environmental movement persons were active in the civil rights movement and learned their organizing skills and other kinds of technical skills from their involvement in the civil rights movement, which they brought over into those other efforts. I wish I could think of the name of the book, but the author is Sarah Evans. Sarah without the H.
Dr. Dickerson?
That's my brother, so that's... and he called me doctor, and he should. So.
I was just wondering whether or not Dr. King ever gave any public acknowledgement of the conduit to Gandhi's philosophy that he may have received.
Oh yes, he spoke often, both in his speeches and in his writings about the direct influence of Gandhi on his own thinking and his own methodology. What's absent from his writings, from his speeches, and that of his peers is any kind of salient acknowledgement of this generation of scholars: Nelson, Howard Thurman, Benjamin Mays, George Kelsey. If you just take some of the texts of King's speeches and you just did a sort of a word check, if you just check the vocabulary, the phraseology, the allegory, the metaphors, they all come out of the writings of these persons whom I've just named. I mean, there's a direct borrowing, a direct emulation of their vocabulary and their ideas. The idea that the objective of nonviolent direct action was to do damage to a system, but not to the system's defenders. I mean, that's George Kelsey directly. And that also, there's a lot that comes out of, as I mentioned, Leo Tolstoy and Howard Thurman in talking about it's important to do nonviolence because that's the only way to protect yourself from the violence that's done to your inner being in the use of violence. So nonviolence is the only way to protect one's own spiritual integrity. King articulated that in very flowery ways, but those basic concepts came from these other intellectual sources.
Has there ever been a concerted nonviolent movement that does not have religious underpinnings? It seems like nonviolence is always connected to a religious sect. I'm trying to see the roots. The root seems to be religious, and I'm wondering if there's.
I would answer it this way: there are, if one, like Nelson would say, like a Thurman would say, there are persons who define religion in the broadest category, who don't see it within the realm of dogma and doctrine from particular sectarian sources, but who see the importance of holding in high regard the dignity of human beings, and in that respect, a whole host of nonviolent movements have drawn from that kind of religious storehouse, and that's religious considered in the broadest possible sense, beyond sectarian, doctrinal, dogmatic pronouncement. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I was thinking that in the intellectual context,
Yeah.
it seems that they all.
Yeah.
Nelson. Nelson was obviously a stellar scholar who had an incredible educational experience and exposure at a time which I wonder how common was that for Black Americans to study at the Sorbonne, to be in Berlin and Marlborough, to travel to India. And what about him as a person? What drove him? What enabled him? How is that possible?
That's an excellent question. It was not all that unusual. There was an elite of African Americans from the late 19th into the 20th century for whom to be educated, to be truly educated, one had to come to Paris or Berlin. Du Bois went to Harvard, but he didn't feel that his Harvard education was quite enough until he came to Berlin to study in the 1890s. Richard R. Wright Jr., a sociologist, did seminary. So you have a small but steady stream of African American scholars who were coming to France and Germany to study. Paris, in particular, in the 1920s, becomes a mecca for African American artists and scholars and musicians. This is to where Josephine Baker came. This is where Ada Bricktop Smith came to open her salon in Paris. There have always been very important, small but significant enclaves of African Americans in Paris and Berlin, in London, to where blacks from not only from the United States but from the colonies of these respective countries have come to get their education, and also to experience greater cultural freedom and of expression than they would find, for example, in the United States. So Nelson, like others, came. He found his very good friend, Rayford Logan. They both became very important colleagues of each other at Howard. They met and were good best buddies here in Paris, and were present there to be translators in the Pan-African Congress and so forth. So this is the place to come during the 1920s. I mean, the numbers we're not talking about the hundreds. We're talking about scores of people. But these persons in their subsequent careers have outsized influence in African American intellectual endeavors.
I'd like to know if we can talk about an intercultural religions influence and dialogue between Muslims, Hindus, and Christians in the Black movement in America, and if so, also another influence in the movement with Michael X and so on.
There was a sharp intellectual cleavage between those persons who were activists, African American Christians, and those persons who were activists, African American Muslims during the 1960s, represented by Malcolm X and others, represented by King, Farmer, and others, because they're not because of their religious differences so much, but because of the differences in political ideology. Those persons on the King, Farmer, the Nelson side were persons who were integrationists, who believed in the possibility of racial comity in the United States. Those who were Muslims were more pessimistic about those prospects and tended to be on the Black nationalist side. And they too had a very interesting and as deep a history in the African American experience as those who were integrationists. They tracked their intellectual progeny back to Marcus Garvey in the early 20th century and back into the 19th century with Henry Turner and Martin Delany. So but it came to fruition in the 1960s between activist Black Christians and activist Black Muslims. You're welcome. Yeah.
My question is also about him personally. Every picture we see, he looks like a sort of meditating Buddha. And I'm just, how was he personally affected and his faith affected? I mean, he doesn't look like the partying Paris kind of changed him very much.
He was a Baptist minister and not an Episcopal priest. But you couldn't. He was, from those I've spoken to who knew him, he was a very soft-spoken, very quiet, very formal, very dignified man. He was not a very sociable. He was not someone who would walk up to you and slap you on the back and say, "Hey, how are you?" That was not. Well, I don't think I'm sure I
and what was his family family background? What kind of environment did he grow up in?
I've said this to a couple of colleagues. It was I was far into the research over the course of years where I found out he came from a fairly elite background. His father was a doctor, but he never told anyone that. He never mentions it in his autobiographical materials and his resumes and nothing. And I happened to find out because I went to Paducah, Kentucky, where he was raised, to the public library and was looking through some of the city directories and found and connected him to his father. His father was a very distinguished physician and a very distinguished and vocal leader of protest in the 1890s. It led protests against Kentucky's passage of a separate railroad car law in the state, but you would never hear William Stuart Nelson speak of it. So no, he did not grow up poor, and so he has a sophistication about him that came from the household in which he was reared. His grandmother and grandfather were major benefactors of one of Kentucky's early Black colleges, a state university in Louisville. But you can only crack these things out of the census and out of some other kinds of records of that sort. You wouldn't hear it from him. Very modest in that respect.
Thank you, Dennis, for a really interesting talk. For me, what's very interesting, these three men, or let's say three of the ones you're talking about, King, Nelson, and Gandhi, marry a moral means to a moral and political end. So it's a strategy, but it ends up changing politics. It's actually, in the two cases, revolutionary, and yet nonviolent. And the question is, would this work everywhere? Or could you, in fact, say that it only works in places where there are certain conditions? That is, the British in India, as horrible as they were, we know more now than we did before, or the racists in the South, that was not Nazi Germany. That was not, Gaddafi's Libya, or we can name regime after regime. There was at least here, the possibility that there's a constitutional solution or some moral restraint. By the way, in the Soviet Union, there was nonviolent movements, and people were not shot or killed. They were rounded up or dispersed or whatever. They also thought there was some rule of law at that time. This is after Stalin, of course. You wouldn't do it under Stalin, right? So isn't the context, my question is about the context.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That's an excellent question. It really goes to the heart of what any book like this will have to grapple with. Yes, it is a difference in context, and there are other contexts that present more ground that's more fertile than in others. But even in the less fertile, even in the more fertile circumstances in which both Gandhi and I would say King, because Nelson is not an activist. He would participate in the demonstration and so forth, but he's not someone who organizes people. So this pertains more to Gandhi and King. Both of them would agree. Certainly Gandhi would, that notwithstanding the fact that India was not Nazi Germany, nonviolence was not an immediately discernible panacea. He was deeply disappointed and deeply depressed in 1947 when he saw, after the partition, it was just chaos all around, and the way in which the Muslims and Hindus, many of whom were his avid followers, just sort of descended into this internecine violence. And he concluded, of course, that these guys they got the tactics, but didn't understand the principles. That the principles were such that they have to be internalized. You can't do nonviolence. You have to be nonviolence. It has become a part of your being. And so, in that respect, I think Gandhi would probably argue that his task was that he was deceived into thinking that his task was far easier than his counterparts who may have been fighting against a Nazi Germany or a Stalinist Russia. In that respect, that even his followers had not completely submitted themselves to the moral discipline that was necessary. That was a mandate of nonviolence. King came to understand the same thing, particularly in 1968, shortly before he died, when as he led the Poor People's March in the sanitation workers' strike, rather, in Memphis. And on a couple of occasions, the demonstrations which he led descended into violence. And he was just determined to demonstrate that nonviolence could work, and it didn't. And so each of them recognized that there were some limits, and they convinced themselves it was because it wasn't the context so much as the inability of their followers to internalize the principles. And I'm not sure if they're correct in thinking that it was that simple. And so, yeah, while I would agree on Nazi Germany is not India after the partition, the task of using nonviolence in either situation was not as easy as any practitioners would think. So thanks for that question.
Well, thank you. This has
Okay.
been just wonderful.
Thank you.